speaks to this idea of blurred lines. It's not just about data-driven design, but it's also about design-driven data.
People are sort of start with whatever data that they've been able to beg, borrow, and steal, and try to answer whatever question they can from that data. That, to me, is exactly the wrong approach.
Through an observation of the data that comes out of user experience, you can redesign experience.
What's the highest impact question we should be asking right now, then figuring out how to get the data to answer that question.
I imagine many of you are readers of Harvard Business Review. If you remember last October's publication, there was an article in there talking about how data scientist is the sexiest job of the 21st century. I was a little curious when I read that, wondering how exactly that was determined, that data scientists were in fact the sexiest. So I investigated. As it turns out, that determination was based solely on the opinion of the authors, both of whom were data scientists. Today I'm joined by two of the supermodels of data science, David Gutelius, and Cameron Turner. They are co-founders of EffectiveUI's data partner, the Data Guild, a strategic data science consultancy based in Palo Alto. I'm going to do bios for each of them. Bear with me as I read through this because Dave's is a little bit detailed. He's had quite a rich career. He's a serial. Okay. Well, he's done a lot. Yeah, he's a serial entrepreneur. He drove data science and technical innovation at Jive Software prior to starting the Data Guild, guided Jive through a successful IPO in 2011, came to Jive a year earlier from Proximal Labs, a company that he founded that Jive then bought. And prior to Proximal, Dave was co-founder and CTO at Social Kinetics. That was a large-scale data mining company in healthcare, which was a spin-out of SRI, the guys that created Siri. Dave was on that team. Previously, at Siri, he founded the Social Computing Group within the AI part of Siri and was product manager for the largest machine learning project in the US government's history. It was a project for DARPA called Calo? Calo, all right. And he worked extensively with national security customers. His background is in behavioral economics. He's got a master's and a PhD from Johns Hopkins in that space. Now Cam holds a degree from Dartmouth. He has another one from Oxford. And he's pursuing yet another one right now at Stanford. But his primary reason for that degree is really to be an environment where he can turn classmates into Data Guild interns and employees. This is not the first time Cam has used school as a launch pad for one of his businesses. While pursuing his first master's at Oxford in 2004-2005, he founded Clickstream Technologies, a digital experience measurement platform, which he then sold to Microsoft. Finding himself back at Microsoft, a company he had worked at previous in his career, he headed up the team responsible for collecting and processing billions of web transactions per day and delivering timely analytics and intelligence to improve the user experience of all of Microsoft's platforms, including Windows, Windows Phone, and Xbox. So Cam, let's unpack that last statement if we could. The part about collecting billions of web transactions per day, would that include error reporting?
It would, but I have to back up. First of all, I have to say, designers are definitely the sexiest, and you can tell you're at a designer event when you have Voss water. So thanks for putting this on for us, you guys. So the role at Microsoft, I think, was one that was during an interesting time, 2009, 2012. For whatever reason, data science was sort of occupying a lot of headlines, a lot of research, a lot of white papers, a lot of projects that were going on. And it was with a group that had been doing large-scale data processing for decades at that point. And so it was sort of fun to see sort of that migration. I think talking to folks in this room sort of before we started, I think a lot of us deal with a similar problem, which is the notion of data science and analytics is not new to us. I mean, it's something that has kind of been a part of our business in one way or the other for a long time. And I think one of the things we can all benefit from and sort of how the conversation is going is to pivot the conversation from sort of verticalized problems, problem solutions to something that can be, we can bring a lot of different experiences and a lot of different businesses together and a lot of different data sets together to solve problems. So that was a part of that role in thinking about cross-product experience, thinking about Microsoft brand experience versus individual product experience, and tying those things together, both in terms of understanding usage and opportunity, as well as getting a better handle on things that cause blue screens of death and those other unsavory things that happen to Windows users sometimes.
And every one of those blue screens or errors it kind of came to you, in a sense. So imagine how overwhelming and maybe non-sexy that might feel.
Well, I think the life lesson for me is working on a platform, with 1 billion customers, is that the complexity of bringing together, all kinds of different technologies on a single platform can result in some strange mixture side effects. And I think that's, one thing that was sort of a good lesson for me in terms of thinking how we proceed in sort of the area of, data science and machine learning, is there's an opportunity always to look sort of beyond the bounds and scope of what your existing problem is, what your existing data set is, in order to identify new opportunity. So I think that's a problem that that Microsoft has, many large companies have, and becomes sort of everyone's problem as consumers of those technologies.
Mm-hmm. And how did you each get drawn into this world? Dave, let's start with you.
Very much by accident from my side. I was a program manager with SRI International at the time, and recognized that at base people weren't asking the right questions with the right data. And I found that, kind of along the lines of what Cam was just describing, if you could combine data that people were not looking at yet, you could create new kinds of products, new kinds of capabilities for customers that just did not exist in the wild. And so, for example, looking at we were working on a project that was focused on military officers serving in Iraq.
You guys here in the back, by the way?
Not that well. Did you guys stand up?
Oh, yeah,
Sure.
Happy to.
Just the mic.
Oh,
Let's use
okay.
the mic. Yeah, let's just do
Okay,
that.
sure. Are we on? Is there a switch, guys? Oh, there we go. Check. There we go. Okay. So in the mid-2000s, you might remember that we weren't doing so well in Iraq, and I was part of a team that was creating analytic tools for forward deployed intelligence officers and Army officers. And some of the problems that we faced were at a really basic level. At a very basic level, we were being out-innovated by people on the ground. People were creating new kinds of explosive devices that we just could not innovate fast enough to remediate. And so, in looking at the problem, I noticed that there's certainly a data problem, but there's also a cultural problem in the way that we were responding to that, in the fact that our officers had to go sort of report what they were seeing up a chain of command and wait for an answer to come down from on high. And of course, all of that takes time. And so the question became, could we shortcut that in some way, create a peer-to-peer kind of learning network and a set of analytic capabilities that could basically help officers get questions answered more quickly, but also more fully and effectively. And so we created this kind of learning capability that learned who you were in the network, what you saw, what you were seeing, your experiences, your expertise, and used all of that information to kind of build a sense of you as a person in this role. And we used that information when new questions came into this community to route questions to the right people. So in a sense, we were able to kind of swarm these very high-performing teams on problems as they came up and address those really quickly. The upshot of the project was pretty dramatic. We saw amazing stories coming out of the field in using this new approach to analytics. And it ultimately wound up saving lives, and we could then get into kind of the enemy's innovation cycle in a similar kind of trajectory and velocity. So it was a really powerful lesson for me. It's kind of the first experience, I guess, that I had in really using data at scale to do something meaningful like this, and it's a lesson that has stayed with me ever since. So the question has always become for me, what's the highest impact question we should be asking right now? And starting with that, and then going out and figuring out how to get the data to answer that question. Instead of the way that it's usually done, we see it over and over again, where people are sort of start with whatever data that they've been able to beg, borrow, and steal, and try to answer whatever question they can from that data. That, to me, is exactly the wrong approach. So that's how I fell into it, and in a very powerful kind of way, I became sort of personally attached to this mission of question first, and then let's figure out how to get the data.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it sounds like, hearing you, it sounds like it speaks to this idea of blurred lines, where it's not just about data-driven design, but it's also about design-driven data, and how can you design a system for that data where it actually becomes quite useful. All right, Kim.
Yeah, well, I think just to extend one of the points that Dave brings up, and around blurred lines too. So my background was actually also from very sort of strange or unexpected source. I was an architecture major in undergrad and planned to go to architecture school. And of course, architecture, everyone knows, is sort of all about form and function. How do you blend form and function effectively and create art that's highly useful? And I think that sort of notion that comes out of the physical world is obviously very applicable in the digital world as well. As I went through sort of the process of internships at various firms and so forth, saw a huge opportunity and scale for what you can do in digital experiences. So I got involved in three-dimensional design and 3D world design through the HIT lab at University of Washington, designing virtual Venice for Telecom Italia and things like that. And then we started to measure sort of what people's experiences were as they moved through virtual spaces. This was in the early 90s, so very nascent, sort of wireframey kinds of stuff. But I think the way that applies over, what got me interested in data and data science, and by the way, be very wary of anyone who has the title data scientist, because there's not official title and there's no accreditation for that title. But I think that the thing that got me interested in becoming a data scientist is the notion that through an observation of the data that comes out of user experience, you can redesign experience, and you can do that in tighter and tighter feedback loops. The teams I worked at initially were in 3-year product releases, where we would consume research, primary research, third-party research, to design a plan for a product that would come out in 3 years. And of course, the world's completely changed by that point, and there's challenges. What we have now is the capability to be constantly redesigning user experience, not just in real time for the masses, but real time on an individual basis. And that's based on a real-time interpretation, and now a machine learning capability that lets the machine interpret that and then customize a user experience. So going back to the point that both Daves made, the two Daves on either side of me, made, I think that I've enjoyed sort of in conversation with EffectiveUI, starting at that point of what's the problem you're trying to solve. When you walk into a bank, when you walk in to a church or a ski lodge or whatever it is you're doing, what's your objective as a user in that experience? How do you get people in and through that space in an effective manner at scale, but do so with style? Make it something that's great. Make it something that's creates an impression for people that they'll go back to, they'll tell their friends about. And I think we do the same thing in my background in software engineering. We do the same thing in that space. We're trying to create those experiences. But you can't do that by starting with the data that you have or starting with the problems that you think you have. You have to start at the conversation at the objective and then work your way back into the solution.
Great, thank you. So at EffectiveUI, we think a lot about human-machine interfaces. And conversely, and relatedly, you guys think a lot about machine-human loops. And I understand there are two schools of thought with machine learning and how that's evolved over time. And you have a certain bias for one over the other. And I'd love for you to tell the group about that and maybe provide an example from your past
Sure.
of it.
Yeah. So how many of you have read the book What the Dormouse Said by John Markoff? It was released in I think 2008 or so. It's a fascinating book. It's about
What is the name again?
What the Dormouse Said. Yeah, and the basic gist is it's a story of how the counterculture in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, but really in the 60s, early 70s, affected the rise of computer science, in particular artificial intelligence, and what that meant. So a bunch of crazy, crazy stories in there about institutionalized LSD usage and stuff that sort of blew my mind in reading it, but with a lot of folks that I actually know. But that book kind of nicely outlines, in the very early days, kind of this split starting in the 50s, but especially in the 60s, between two schools of thought in artificial intelligence. And they've lasted till today, and one has sort of won out over the other. One was kind of typified by Stanford's Artificial Intelligence Lab, SAIL, very famous place. And that school of thought was really around creating machines that were self-learning and self-taught that could basically mimic the human brain at some level. The other school of thought, which was typified by SRI, kind of the other side of campus, Stanford Research Institute at that point, was really around thinking about machines in this, what Dave sort of described as this human-machine loop, and the notion that machines can learn from humans, but humans can also learn from machines, and the combination of those two actors creates a very powerful symbiosis. And that was typified by Doug Engelbart. Does that name ring a bell at all here? Doug Engelbart was one of the founders of social computing. He did this thing called, I'll send the link to Dave and he can send it to the group here. But it was called the mother of all demos. It was done at Stanford in 1968. And he basically anticipated everything that you see today. He actually demoed working versions of social computing, real-time computing, peer-to-peer collaboration, real-time communications, back in 1968 when there wasn't even an internet yet. It's an amazing demo. But the point was that the school that eventually won out was SAIL, and this notion that we see kind of today with, unfortunately, how Siri has turned out. It's not how I designed it, but and the other things that we were working with in Kalo, where it's the expectation, especially from a user point of view, is that you have these sort of semi-magical robots in the machine that somehow learn to do things better by watching you. And I've always thought that that was kind of backwards, or at least it missed a real opportunity in creating more of a symbiotic relationship. And the project that I described a few minutes ago with the military was actually an example of this loop we constructed, where we spent, probably 8 months working with users of this system to get the UI right. Why? Because if the signal that you're drawing out of your user population is noisy or ambiguous or sparse, any number of undesirable characteristics, the signal that then goes into the machine learning capability is also noisy, sparse, and the ultimate performance is kind of crappy. So getting the design part of that right winds up being absolutely crucial to designing an effective human-machine learning loop. Because the better that signal is, the smarter that and the faster that machine capability can become. And so that's become a kind of pattern in my work, is finding opportunities where, from an analytic point of view, we can combine sort of these things that machines do really well at huge scale, but can help users scale at that very human kind of side where you need some sort of human judgment. Humans are really, really good at sussing out, difficult gray area problems at smaller scale. And so the challenge becomes, can you design systems that work both of those strengths and ultimately create better capabilities? And so some of the most interesting projects that we're getting into now that we have large-scale data systems that we can cobble together pretty quickly with really intuitive, effective, not to no pun intended, but effective UI. Because the more effective that UI is, the more capable the humans are of really harnessing the power of whatever data is that you're trying to get at. And that's ultimately about answering questions, it's about deriving insight, and it's a hugely important and underappreciated, I think, vision of what's possible.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, maybe just to extend that point, there's an analogy that's described. I think it's a TED Talk where they talk about the condor and the bicycle. If people heard this one, so if you look at humans in terms of their calorie to distance efficiency and how far people can go on 100 calories, they're way down on the list of mammals and animals versus pretty much everything else out there. We're just not designed to consume energy and then move a long ways. And the California condor is like way above because they can soar and hit thermals and do all kinds of great things to cover lots of ground when they're hunting. So, but then along came the bicycle, and the bicycle actually blows the California condor away. Now, a bicycle, of course, can't ride itself, but when you throw a human on it, all of a sudden they're doing something that's hitting a massively different and unexpected scale than the form that you see that took millions of years of evolution. And I think that's kind of it's fun to sort of watch on the data side, similar opportunities where if we can identify ways to sort of massively increase scale, that's where you get a lot of interest from people traditionally that may not have been so interested in data, because that translates over into balance sheets and income statements and your capability to bring a product to market, your ability to service and support a customer base, and how quickly you can do sales. So identifying sort of that sweet spot that Dave describes where you can take automation so far but not leave the human out of that equation and understand sort of exactly how the human fits into that overall system such that they're at the helm of a massively powerful feedback machine that can basically take the business further. I think that's where we get into a lot of exciting conversations with clients anyway, is identifying those kinds of questions.
Great. And building on that, at EffectiveUI and other UX groups at our clients, everyone's thinking about designing for particular personas, creating a UI that's optimized for a persona. And that's a way of getting away from a one-size-fits-all UI. Now there's the next level of that, which is dynamic UI and rearranging the experience as a response to learning about the individual. I'd be curious to get your guys' thoughts on that.
So from a pure technical capability point of view, yes, we have this amazing ability now to segment, let's say, users in ways that we never could before, especially if you've got access to large-scale complex data, right? So there's psychographics you can derive. There's certainly traditional demographics you can derive. But if you, again, kind of go back to my earlier point of looking at external data sources and combining this with internal data you might have access to, like zip code level or sub-zip code level census data. All of a sudden and this is not to kind of make an analogy with the NSA, but you can derive a lot more kind of insight into who you're trying to serve and use that ultimately to shape the kinds of experiences that you can then offer to customers effectively. Now, so that's one point, but there's, I think, a danger there as well, especially in terms of user experience. One issue is trust, and the success that any of us have with customers ultimately derives from this notion of trust, right? There's a sense of implicit trust when someone visits your web assets or your mobile assets or whatever, that you're not going to do something harmful to them or use their data in a way that they would not expect. And so thinking through kind of design questions from that trust aspect and making sure that you're not violating that either implicitly or explicitly with your users is hugely important. The other thing is there is something to be said for consistency, and a lot of it depends on the application, of course, but a lot of users actually rely on being able to have a consistent experience. So the advice I think I would give there in general is be careful about how you use the power. There's tremendous power in terms of what the data can do, but it can also be harmful if you don't think fully through the implications of what you're up to.
Yeah, I'll provide one example as sort of a shout out to our co-presenter Jane and a bunch of folks from Wells Fargo. So I'm a Wells Fargo customer. Our business is a Wells Fargo account, and have been for 20 years or so now. And the danger, I think, with personas and segmentation generally is you'll be programmed to think about your market in a certain way that's prescribed, and typically you've prescribed that. The data hasn't designed that for you. As a Wells Fargo customer, I've enjoyed, having started multiple businesses, bringing them up, winding them down, having my personal account sitting there, being able to do transfers, bill pay automation, having credit sit there, buy and sell houses, mortgages show up on my screen, they drop off. That scenario where I, as an individual, as a homeowner, as a business owner, as an individual, as a student, all these things come together in a view where I, as a person, am sort of addressed in that experience. And I think that's rare in sort of UI design today, and I think a lot of that comes from the artificial silos that we sort of create based on segmentation. So there's a risk in doing that. They're very cozy. It's very cozy to design a persona with some attributes and a stock photo, and you put it on the wall, and you're like, okay, we're designing for Charlie or whatever it is. But there is a risk that Charlie, when he goes home, is someone completely different than he is at work, is someone completely different in other parts of his life. And so the future, I think, is definitely about sort of crumbling the walls between those experiences. And fundamental to that, and sort of from our angle or our view of the market from the data side, is sort of doing the correct things to join those silos. Because you can't really start to draw conclusions about what the data is telling you if you don't have a way of doing that. So I think, on the data side anyway, it's just sort of a note of encouragement that the more we can do to standardize, sort of at a technical level, create joins between the data sets as companies work between each other to create those experiences, I think the better off we all are.
Are there any questions right now?
There is an increased expectation that there is some level of personalization or customization to the experience. But you can do that pretty easily by pulling common elements, let's say, from the mobile platform. And as long as your app isn't, the point of which isn't to like an app like Prismatic, it's all custom feeds of news based on your persona. You can get away with things like welcome screens that use simple things like using their first names. Again, I think you have to be a little bit careful in terms of how far you push that, because different folks have different concerns about privacy. And one thing that I've been noticing recently is an increased concern around use of personal information. And so even if you're not really going deeply and like mining someone's contact list, I mean, I don't know how much of this is due to the recent NSA blow up, but there's just this, it's on people's minds, right? And so being extra careful about how you're using information and being transparent, again, gets to that trust question. It puts you in a good position with the user. And over a simple kind of usability decision, I think getting the trust component right is ultimately more impactful to whether or not you'll both acquire that user and keep them than the design of the homepage.
Yeah, it's a great place to talk about trust, and I think also there's a simple rule of thumb that I think can be valuable, which is if you think about the user experience, and again going back to sort of the machine plus human idea and that blurred line idea. What would you expect a human to do? Like if you walked into this room today and a stranger walked up and the first 10 questions they asked you, they didn't let you say anything except for what your name was, what your home address is, what your phone number is, giving you 2 emails and your password that you like to have before we interact. Like we're very tolerant in technology today to let technology do that to us, pay this tax as a barrier to entry before we get to the experience. And I think that has a limited shelf life. Like that can't go on. And I think the smarter way or the rule of thumb is if you're interacting, like what would you expect in an interaction? What's the golden rule that you would apply back to the product that you're designing, for yourself? And then how do we, as we give and take information to each other, just like we do in a social setting, what's the expectation of what we do with that information and how we leverage it? If I take your business card today, are you going to start getting junk mail from me every morning? Like that's just not, it's just not acceptable. And yet there's still, very well-known brands that kind of behave that way. And I think that's something that will evolve. So bringing the golden rule into that blurred lines conversation, I think, is a good sort of rule of thumb. I think one of the hallmarks of data science innovation technology is personalization. And I think that's not something that just the tech industry can take credit for, and certainly not something that statisticians and data scientists can take credit for. I think it's a cultural shift that's happened. We're sort of in our professional lives, we don't carry around a veneer of being a certain kind of business person. We're just ourselves, and that's something that's, I think, just changed in the world in the last 10 or 15 years maybe, where there's that expectation that we interact as individuals, that we're a little more open with our information, but there's there's not sort of that layer, and people act as individuals. In companies, it's certainly true in organizational dynamics and behavior. So I think that's maybe a difference. The truth is, I think in .com, and I was in the Valley in mid and late 90s, is we just didn't know. It was too early to know whether pets.com was going to be the next big thing or a joke. Like we didn't have the information. People were sorting out what the internet is, what digital content was, how people would consume, and we certainly didn't have the devices that we have today to bring it into all spaces of our lives. So I think that again, going back to sort of the blurred lines theme, I think that's something that's just all blurred together: personal, professional, home life, work life. These are things that have now, for better or worse, have come together. And so there's that, again, sort of that expectation. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. One, I don't know what big data means. As someone who works with very large scale data sets and real-time streaming, I'm not sure what that term includes anymore. It probably does more harm than good at this point. It's mostly used by vendors to describe a certain market capability. It does not necessarily describe a technical capability. However, I would say that over time, sort of data's been around for a long time. Our ability to deal with scale data or real-time data or heterogeneous data has sort of shifted over time as kind of industry needs have changed. I will say that there seems to be, within the last, especially for maybe 5 years, but probably four-ish years, the concern over using data at some scale or at some level of complexity has certainly grown. Does that mean that those companies who can harness that data capability necessarily do better than those who don't? No. Again, it goes back to the question you're trying to address. And for some questions, you absolutely need that sort of capability. For others, you absolutely do not. Facebook is a big data company, if there ever was one, right? Do they absolutely need that level of insight into people to do what they do? Well, in a sense, because their revenue derives ultimately from advertising, largely speaking. And so the thesis is, by knowing more about who you are and who you know and what you're going to do and all this stuff, they can send you more relevant things. Has that happened? I don't know. I mean, it hasn't happened with me. Maybe it's happened with you. I don't get the sense that advertising is any better than it ever was anywhere. In fact, it's a lot more annoying. So I would really hesitate to draw a kind of causation between the ability to work at some scale and complexity with the either velocity of innovation or the ability for a particular application to succeed. Yes, it's possible, but it's more dependent on the product itself and what you're after, and having a good team that can execute on the problem. I don't see a lot of super impressive efforts. I think it goes back to almost that original split in AI, but a larger sense of what we expect from machines to do for us. And the expectation from both an industry point of view, but also from a product design point of view, tends to be that these things, these machines, are basically our slaves. And we kind of outsource the really slave-like tasks to them and expect magic to happen. So, I mean, there've been attempts. There've been kind of quiet attempts over time to try to explore a kind of higher order or a different kind of capability. Doug was certainly the first out of the gate back in the 60s. And I'd like to think that the companies I've started have done a little bit of that. And I do see, some others. There's the CIA has a venture arm called InQtel, and they tend to fund kind of way ahead stuff, stuff that people are not thinking about, generally speaking, right now, because they have a very long-term time horizon. And they operate completely in the open, so it's all above board. And the types of things that InQtel is funding tend to be pretty interesting, all the way from sort of advanced sensors and thinking about using sensors in different ways and harnessing those sensors in very large-scale networks. So sensing everything from kind of social context to physical or chemical context, and using that capability to derive intelligence about what's up at any given point at a very large scale. So those are the kinds of moonshot things that more people should be working on. But even at a more prosaic level, I think, from a philosophical point of view and the types of projects that the Data Guild is getting involved with, we're taking on challenges that have some kind of global reach or impact. So thinking about energy efficiency and creating not just optimizations on products that help create efficiencies, but more specifically analytic capabilities that help operators, help users, help business decision makers, again, derive more insight out of these very large scale, very complex systems that are hard to understand if you don't have kind of specialized knowledge. And working with customers to develop ways of simplifying that and ultimately giving them tools so that they can dig down and grab the power of what's possible there and make it useful, right? And that's a pattern that I think we'd like to repeat. I mean, we're a fairly new little outfit, but it's a pattern we'd like to repeat across a bunch of different verticals, whether it's healthcare, national security, these large-scale sensor networks, organizational analytics, and firm productivity and effectiveness. There are lots of things that we're just beginning to get a sense that we have some data for, that we have very few tools to really make use of. So I think that's the exciting part. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of models to follow right now.
The term data comes from the Latin term datum, which means to share. And I think that that's such a powerful statement because I think all of us can think of examples where that's exactly the problem that we have with data today, is that it's locked away in a silo. It's something that we can't access. We can't ask it questions in the way that we'd like to ask it. But sharing data both horizontally inside of organizations, across companies, but also then to customers as a part of the product. The notion of the data as a portion of the product, things like the up band and personal metrics. I mean, that's just exploding because there's a huge appetite to take advantage of what we know when it's presented in a way that we can actually take action, take action on that. So I think that's, that notion of being able to share back is really important.
So I'll give you 2 examples. The first company I started, Social Kinetics, was a behavioral health company. And the point of it was to use large-scale machine learning over large patient populations to do a very special kind of segmentation, which is to understand what intervention pathways you, as a patient dealing with chronic disease, responded the best to. So from, usually get your PDF from your provider. It says, hey, you should really lose weight. Here's some tips on how to lose weight. And not a lot of us respond well to that. But if you could think of kind of a hierarchy of intervention strategies and then the kind of total goal of getting someone slightly healthier over time, not just getting them to quit smoking, but what are the steps involved to get someone to commit, to realize they have a problem, to getting social support or social help for that, to a maintenance phase where they've actually, maintained that choice. It's a complex series of steps psychologically to get someone to that point. So you could think of it as a very targeted marketing campaign, but one that ultimately involves people making very different choices about their lives. And so that is kind of, I refuse to work on advertising campaigns. It's just a philosophical thing for me. I have zero interest in doing this. But in this kind of domain, you're using a lot of the same techniques and tools, frankly, to get to that end result for that patient as you do in something like a marketing campaign. It's just a lot more complex. So on the opposite end of the spectrum is this, the up band. And I'm a big fan of quantified personal analytics. And I can tell you that in my own personal experience, I've had this, I think, 3 months. It's already helped me in several different ways. I always thought I got 8 hours of sleep. Turns out I almost never get 8 hours of sleep. And so I started to basically run experiments on myself and my environment, and found that I live in a really kind of noisy place. It's got a lot of ambient light that comes in from the outside, and so taking measures to remediate some of that has actually affected my sleep patterns, and this is one of those things that actually tracks kind of light versus deep sleep. And so it winds up being, when I make those changes, a meaningful difference to me because I'm actually alert when I wake up and alert for events like this. And then activity-wise, I mean, it's a great way to understand kind of in total how you're moving throughout the day, and little changes that you can make that actually have a meaningful impact on your life. So I think that's kind of at the opposite end of that spectrum, where we can actually use data in a very elegant, very simple UI. I don't know if you've seen the Up analytic UI, but it's not fancy, but it's enough to start asking the right questions, right? And start to take action on what you find in that application. So that's kind of two examples of what you're talking about there.